Hello, this is Kelsey from Kelsey Reads Things at Anna Porter Public Library in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And I am very excited today to finally be discussing with you two books. So we're changing it up today. I am sharing with you some information about A Court of Frost and Starlight, which is the novella from the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, as well as the next installment that follows it, which is A Court of Silver Flames, which focuses on Feyre's feisty sister, Nesta. So first I'm going to discuss A Court of Frost and Starlight in its most basic terms of plot. Okay, so what occurs during A Court of Frost and Starlight, Feyre and her friends of the Night Court are finally having a chance to wind down after the intense war against Hybern and enjoy their time together before and during the festivities of the winter solstice. Though there is a lot of joy and relaxation, there's also this growing tension between Feyre, her inner circle, and Nesta specifically. Nesta has experienced a lot of trauma, just like many of the characters have, after and during the events of the war, and even before the events of the war. So at this time, she is really grappling with a lot of her own trauma, and because of that, there's been a wedge that's been created even further between her youngest sister and her. At this time, Feyre also creates an art studio that is available for the children of Prythian, mostly the children of Valaris who have lost family or experienced other trauma during the events of the war. And Rhys and Feyre decide to start to try and have a family. And that kind of is the general plot of the book, the basics of what happens. And this novella, you should know, acts as a bridge between the original story, where it's all told from Feyre's perspective, to where the story is going to eventually lead. And that's when it starts eventually, of course, with Nesta's story. There should be at least 3 more books coming out for this series, I believe. I know there's going to be 1 more novella, and I believe at least 2 more standalone books, and there may be more. Hopefully Sarah J. Maas will give us more. Alrighty, now I'd like to discuss the general plot for A Court of Silver Flames. It's been 9 months since the events of A Court of Frost and Starlight, and unfortunately Nesta hasn't shown any sign of improving since we last saw her. She has been eaten alive by her own trauma, her own grief, and her own guilt for events that occurred during, before, and after the war. She's been caught in an endless cycle of binge drinking, love-making, taking strangers to her bed, and basically wasting away to nothing. She's also been gambling a lot of her sister and Rhys's money, and it comes to a point where Feyre finally has to put her foot down, this High Lady, and basically orders Nesta to the House of Wind in order to train with Cassian, and she does this in hopes to help her, because training ended up helping Feyre. Can the inner circle and Cassian help Nesta heal and find a way back to herself in this story? Or will Nesta forge her own path and find her own found family? You'll need to find out by reading A Court of Silver Flames. Okay, so that was the general premise, the general plot line of what occurs in A Court of Silver Flames. I will say this book has more to do with character growth and development. That is the main themes of the book. There's also quite an emphasis on self-love and self-healing. For instance, there's quite a bit of concentration on concentrating. Meditation. They call it mind stilling in the book, but it was very, very prominent, and it was an important plot line to the book, and it really helped Nesta center herself and put all of her anxiety and fears and the voices in her head telling her that she's not good enough, or she's made too many mistakes, or she's not redeemable, they eventually fall away. And that was really beautiful, that there was just this note and emphasis on self-love and taking time for yourself, and also not just that, but taking time to take care of yourself. And that includes doing things such as exercising and meditation, and just taking a moment to take everything in. So that was an important process that Nesta goes through. And I just wanted to let my audience know that there is, a general plot in the book. There's definitely enemies that they are facing that they have experienced previously. There are definitely threats throughout, but the main focus of the book is on Nesta and her growth. And not only her growth, but also the healing of the relationships that she has in her life that she has really tried to sever. And a lot of that she made occur because of her own feelings of worthlessness and that she doesn't deserve the love and care of those who love and care about her. So I think this story in general was just a beautiful self-growth journey. Some things that you should know as an audience about this book specifically is it is definitely an adult fantasy series. There are several instances where adult content is present, and there are definitely a lot of heavy topics in this book. A few of the triggers that you should know about include mentions of previous sexual assault, heavy alcohol use, and lots of adult romantic scenes. There are instances of suicidal thoughts, just poor mental health in general, and finally examples of possible addiction. So those are just a few of the triggers that you should know about. And I believe I've discussed this before, but in case I haven't, A Court of Thorns and Roses was originally published as a new adult fantasy series. However, that category hasn't really taken off in library world or even in the bookstore world. And later on, Bloomsbury made the decision to start publishing the remainder of the books as adult fantasy, and I definitely agree with that decision. Again, it's never, ever my intention to determine or police my audience in terms of what you should read. I'm just giving you the basics of information that this is an adult fantasy series and some things that you should be aware about. Okay, so now that we're done with the heavy stuff, I'd like to discuss some things that I genuinely loved about this book. So for one, we all know that Nesta is a bit of a prickly character. She's one of those characters that you almost love to hate, and you're never really sure quite why she is the way she is or why she reacts to things in the manner that she does. However, I, being an empathetic person, could kind of see a few things from Nesta's point of view, but I am so glad that I read her book specifically, this next installment specifically, because I understood her so much more thoroughly and empathized with her journey and her place in the world so much more. We learn a little more history about her mother, because we didn't really get a lot from Feyre, but we learned that Feyre was pretty much neglected by their mother, and even Nesta confirms that in this book. She was kind of her mother's toy, and Elaine and Feyre were her father's, I guess, project. Got the most attention, not really sure how to say that. There is a lot of humility in every single character throughout this book. Lots and lots of examples of humility, so that was really refreshing to see. In general, as I mentioned, it's a beautiful story about self-growth and Nesta's own. I love the found families theme. It's one of the reasons why A Court of Mist and Fury is one of my favorite books of all time, and this one is as well. In fact, the two pretty much tie for my absolute favorites. So good job, Sarah J. Maas. There was so much romance, so much love between characters, and not even just romantic love. There was platonic love, there was sisterly love, there was so much love and pain exhibited throughout this book, and I thought that the way that it was done was exceptional and realistic. There were lots of whimsical themes throughout the book. In fact, a few things reminded me of a Miyazaki film. And I won't say too much about that because I don't want to give anything away, but there's lots of magic and whimsy throughout this book, which was really exciting to read about because it's generally a pretty heavy topic book, but at the same time there was so much fun too. So that was something that I really enjoyed about the book, is there was lots of comedic and also just like wholesome moments. So that was nice to kind of help round out the entire book. Perseverance of characters was admirable and something that I aspire to. And again, there was so much friendship and so much love, and it just made my heart so happy. Now I'd like to discuss some quotes that I think really resonated with the purpose of the book. On page 2, it's about Nesta and the cauldron and when she is first inserted. This is like a flashback. It was a kiss of venom, a death so permanent that every inch of her roared in defiance. She was going in, but she would not go gently. So intense. I love it. On page 14, this has to do with Nesta and her coping mechanisms in terms of how she deals with her trauma. What would his fear smell like if she learned she'd used him, slept with him to keep herself at bay? And at this point, she's mentioning a random fae male that she's had in her bed. To settle that writhing darkness that has simmered inside her from the moment she emerged from the cauldron. Sex, music, and drink. She'd learned this past year. All of it helped. Not entirely, but it kept the power from boiling over. Even if she could still feel it streaming through her blood, coiled tight around her bones. This is another quote just about some things that Nesta is experiencing through her trauma. Some days, the sheer dread of panic locked Nesta's body up so thoroughly that nothing could get her to breathe. Nothing could stop the awful power from the beginning to rise, rise, rise in her. Nothing beyond the music at those taverns, the card games with strangers, the endless bottles of wine, and the sex that made her feel nothing, but offered a moment of release amid the roaring inside her. So those are only 3 quotes that I'm going to mention because otherwise I feel like I'm spoiling the story. I really touched on a lot of the main topics, which were trauma, dealing with trauma, coping mechanisms, and meditation, self-love, and growth. I definitely gave this story a 5-star rating. I loved it so much. It was phenomenal, one of the best, in my opinion, that Sarah has written to date. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.